All right, everyone. Thank you for calling into this evening's presentation. Tonight we have the honor of being joined by Joe Carberry, who will be giving us a presentation on personal locator beacons and two-way satellite communication devices. And to more medically minded folks like me, and they're all the same, right? But actually, no. So our discussion tonight will be on the pros and cons of dedicated search and rescue beacons versus commercial satellite messaging devices. So those like the Spot, InReach, Bivystick, and then Somewear. So Joe will break down how each of these systems operates, their flexibility, and then the rough cost to purchase and use them. And as a bit of background, Joe's an engineer who's been involved in space operations, such as the Space Shuttle, GPS, and the military space for over 30 years. He's been hiking and climbing in Colorado for over 20 years and is a CMC trip leader, instructor, and a graduate of the High Altitude Mountaineering School. So with that, I'll turn things over to Joe. I would just ask that participants please put themselves on mute to the end of the presentation. If you have a question, please just type it in the chat box and we'll do our best to answer those at the end. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Joe Carberry. I'm going to give you this presentation tonight on personal locator beacons and satellite communicator devices. Let's see if I can take control here. All right, here we go. What are PLBs and satellite communication devices? Really, they're handheld units that utilize satellites to allow you to request, rescue, and potentially text-like communication beyond regular cell service. There's currently 4 different systems that are in use. They're the COSPAS, SARSAT, International Consortium. Basically, a PLB falls into that category, as well as marine and aviation variations of PLB. There are several Iridium satellite-based systems that include the InReach, Somewear, Bivystick, and Zoleo. There are one basically global star satellite-based system, that's the Spot and the Spot X. And then there's an Intelsat geostationary-based system called SatPack that I'll briefly describe as well. Okay, so what is COSPAS SARSAT? COSPAS SARSAT is a name composite of, I'll let whoever's good at Russian pronounce that, but it's the equivalent in Russian is Space System for Satellite of Vessels in Distress, and SARSAT, which is Search and Rescue Satellite. So the COSPAS is something that was originated in the former Soviet Union, and SARSAT is something the United States had, and those two were kind of merged to provide kind of much more robust coverage. There are really 3 kinds of beacons. There are Emergency Position Indication Radio Beacon, EPIRB, that are for marine use. Kind of that image just to the left of that text is a marine unit. They can be either manually activated or they can potentially be activated if they're set up in a certain way to come on as soon as they contact water. There are emergency locator transmitters, ELTs, which are for aviation use, and then personal locator beacons, which are kind of the third of the iteration, but basically it's using that same technology for recreational, typically land use. All of these beacons need to be registered with the appropriate organization. For the United States, that's NOAA to use them. So COSPAS SARSAT is, again, a cooperative venture originally between the US and the former Soviet Union, starting in 1977. But it's grown to be partnership with 45 different nations around the planet. So its first rescue was in 1982. It became fully operational in 1983. The US participation includes the US Air Force, US Coast Guard, NASA, and NOAA. It's a pretty robust system. There are typically on the order of about 2,500 rescues per year that are made with this system. The COSPAS SARSAT, AKA for the rest of this discussion, I'll call them PLBs. It's a government-sponsored system. It's subscription-free. It's purpose-built. Basically, it's a one-way call for help. It's what I call pseudo-military grade. It's been ruggedized. They have certain requirements for waterproof and kind of ruggedness that you might expect to see in a military system. They have a proprietary Cat 2 battery that's built to operate even at the end of the battery's kind of shelf life for 24 hours at minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit. They have a 5 watt transmitter, so it's a relatively robust transmitter. It broadcasts 2 different signals. It broadcasts the 406 megahertz digital signature that is in the UHF band that's typically encoded with your GPS coordinates, and it will basically go out to a whole bunch of satellites, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. In addition, it will continue to transmit about every 10 minutes your position, so that if you, for example, were moving because you were fearful of an avalanche or other kind of a wildfire or something else, the receiver would continue to broadcast your position as you moved along, so that if rescuers could in fact follow you. In addition to the 406 megahertz signal, there's 121 megahertz analog homing signal in the VHF range that search and rescue could use to basically hone in on you. They have a receiver that's intended to help them provide directional information. So once they get in close, even if the GPS signal is bouncing off of cliffs or other things, they'll be able to use that 121 megahertz signal to, in effect, home in on you. And lastly, they all have a flashing strobe, so that if, for example, at night, that's one more indication that would help search and rescue folks to be able to help locate you. I've got one of these here. This is an Acer PLB. It's about 10 years old. Battery's been replaced already once, but I'll kind of pass around the local room that we have here. But I'm sure you could find something similar if you went to REI or other places. I've got shown 3 different iterations. Again, there's probably a dozen or more different options that you can purchase. They typically range in the price of $250 to $500, depending upon what features you have. But you can see that they're all relatively small. So they fit in a pack pretty well, but I'll talk to you more about the advantages of these over other devices here as we go. Okay, so what makes up the space side of the COSPAS SARSAT system? So because it's a consortium that's using a whole bunch of different satellites that are in 3 different regimes. If you're familiar with satellite systems, I'll admit I'm going to kind of bore you here, but for those that aren't familiar with it, there's basically 3 different regimes that are most common. There's low Earth orbit, which is typically a few hundred miles above the Earth. There's mid-Earth orbit, which is roughly 11,000 miles up. That's where GPS and Galileo sit, as well as GLONASS and the Chinese equivalent Beidou. And then there's geostationary, which is about 36,000 kilometers or about 22,000 miles up. So COSPAS SARSAT actually has receivers in all 3 of those regimes. You can see the numbers there, but they have a total currently, as of about a month ago, 58 satellites. And the geometry distribution that they provide is really important and really makes for a really robust system. Again, some of the satellites that make up the overall system are NOAA, like GOES, US GPS satellites, European Galileo, which is a European equivalent to GPS, GLONASS, like their K2 version or their latest iteration of GLONASS, as well as some other satellites. This system provides worldwide coverage with near instantaneous notification, and I'll give some examples to show you how that happens. But some of these systems have satellite-to-satellite crosslinks, so that even if a particular satellite that sees you can't see the ground, it can pass it off to, say, another member of its same family. So, for example, if a Galileo satellite saw you but wasn't in view of a ground station, it could pass it to its Galileo neighbor and have that satellite send it down. It is by far the best option in what I call a terrain mast environment, where you've got mountains or canyons or other kind of things that might impact your view of the sky. And I'll try to show some examples of that as we go on. So on the ground side, for COSPAS SARSAT, there are 114 local user terminals. The local user terminals are kind of based on the system. So for the low Earth orbit, there's 59. For mid Earth orbit, there's 26. And for the GEO, there's 29. And you can kind of see the distribution of those. They are really all over the planet. So in addition to the local user terminals, there are mission control centers that kind of collect that information from those local user terminals and start to act on it. There are 35 mission control centers across the globe, and they're shown in the lower right-hand graphic. Okay, so I'll try to kind of walk you through what happens in a sequence for a deployment of one of these devices. So let's say something bad's happened. You kind of reach into your pack, you pull out your PLB, you deploy your antenna, something like this, hit the big red button, pointing towards the sky, and wait. That signal will go up and will be collected by LEO, GEO, or MEO satellites. They'll potentially cross-link them within each other, within the system, but they'll get those down to a ground terminal, so the LUT, the local user terminal. The local user terminal will then send it across to all of the mission control centers. The mission control center will then send it to the appropriate rescue coordination center. So the rescue coordination center is kind of, we'll talk a little bit more in detail about it, but those are the people who are actually going to define and send in the appropriate resources. So for example, if you were climbing the backside of Pikes Peak, the Teller County search and rescue probably would be the search and rescue, or sheriff's department would be determined because of your location. They would know what is the best resource to provide to get to you. So I'm just walking through this. So it goes over to the local user terminal from the satellite. From there, it goes to the mission control center. From there to the rescue coordination center, where now you're really getting people involved, and you're actually determining who are the right people, what SAR forces are the best ones to deploy to help you. And they will then send it to the appropriate, in this example, it's Teller County Search and Rescue, and then they will deploy to try to provide the rescue. Okay, so those, kind of summarizing what I said in the graphics, but those signals are routed through mission control centers. The US Mission Control Center is run by NOAA, and it's in Suitland, Maryland. The beacon owner is identified through your registration. So as soon as an alert has been registered with the Mission Control Center, an alert is sent out to the people that you registered with the beacon to say that, hey, something's going on and we're attempting a rescue of your loved one. The location of the alert basically determines how rescue is coordinated. If the rescue, or if the emergency is in the continental United States, That information is passed to the U.S. Air Force Rescue Coordination Center, or AFRCC. It's in Tyndall Air Force Base, Florida. If it's in Alaska, it's passed to the Alaska RCC, which is at Elmendorf Air Force Base in Alaska. And then again, that Rescue Coordination Center knows all of the resources that are available in their appropriate area to be able to determine who is the right resource to provide a rescue. Sorry, I got a thirsty dog here. So she's helping me out. If the alert occurs outside of the U.S., other international MCCs will coordinate with the appropriate resources to initiate a rescue. So again, there are 34. Hey, John, it's in the bottom of the. There are 34, actually 33 RCCs outside of the United States that are all well informed and certain to be able to ensure that the right resources are put to bear to help you out. Okay, so what are the pros and cons of the COSPAS SARSAT system? Pro is it's an internationally sponsored system. You can be pretty sure that this is not going to be a victim of a poor business model or something else that's going to potentially impact a commercial system. They provide worldwide coverage with near instantaneous alerts due to the wide range of receivers, satellite receivers that are there. The standards for the handheld units that make up COSPAS SARSAT PLB are pretty rigid. They are basically regulations or requirements for temperature, vibration, shock. They have a 5-watt transmitter, which is very strong. It's got a shelf life of 5 to 7 years. Some of the smaller ones have a slightly shorter lifetime. But at the end of that life, you'll have to send the unit in to get the battery replaced. It's not a user replaced item. There is no subscription or service fee to use it. It is the highest reliability and highest robustness, and in my opinion, lowest cost, ownership cost. So what are the cons? There is no messaging capability. And there are a few units that have what I'll talk to you in a minute about called the return link service that kind of gives you a little bit of peace of mind if you're in a bad way. So what is this return link service? So return link service began to be available in PLBs that are sold in the European Union. I have seen nothing to indicate when they're going to be available outside of the European Union, but the return link signal is provided via the European Galileo satellites. So if you deploy your receiver, I believe it will go anywhere in the world. So if you happen to have been in Europe and picked up a PLB there and deployed it in the United States, I think you'll get the same service. But the Toulouse Mission Control Center will receive the signal of your alert, and then it will determine if your unit has a return link service capable receiver. It'll send information to the Galileo satellites, and then it's going to send down with, I believe it's going to be L-band frequency to the return link service. And within about 15 minutes of your activation, assuming everything goes right, your receiver will turn blue, or there will be a blue light that will come on and it will indicate that, hey, your signal has been received. This system did close and you've got, folks are on the way. It doesn't tell you any more than that. It doesn't tell you, oh, well, can you find an open spot? No, it just gives you that kind of peace of mind that, okay, my signal has been received and there are people coming. So that could be a real peace of mind, especially if perhaps it were a family, a close, really good friends that just you're very, very concerned about the safety of the people you're with. That could be a really nice thing to have. But again, there are very few. I would put it at probably half of 1% of receivers that currently provide that capability. I imagine it's going to grow, but right now it's very limited. So there is kind of sort of a PLB messaging feature that Acer provides. It's called Acer 406 Link Beacon Test Self-Service. So it's a kind of a one-way preset message of I'm okay, or I'm okay and I'm here, to predetermined recipients via text or email. There's no message return capability. It's not, you don't get anything back from the recipient. There is an annual subscription fee associated with it, but there's some real limitations to it. Well, I guess I should say that the way that it works is it uses the personal locator beacon's self-test capability. So there's a way that you can test the beacon to make sure that it's functional. So it basically does a self-check of the unit and then sends off a quick signal, kind of single shot message to the satellites. And Acer is contracted with goes east and goes west, which are roughly over Louisiana and over roughly Vancouver, but they're out of the geo belt, so they're 22,000 miles up. If any other CoastPass SARSAT system receiver receives that signal, it's pretty much ignored. It doesn't go anywhere. But it's limited in its single shot nature in that if there was some tree cover or something when you sent that, it might not go through. The other thing is that now you're having to talk to satellites that are at the geo belt. So if in the Northern Hemisphere there are any mountains to your south, there's a decent chance that won't go through. And I'll provide an example of that. The other thing is that there's a limited number of self-tests. So I have a pretty robust unit, and I've used this system for a couple of years. I think it allows for, at least the unit I had, the battery will accommodate 400 self-tests of I'm okay, or approximately 60 tests of I'm okay and I'm here. But again, at the end of that, you don't want to go beyond that because you're getting into the kind of you've used up any kind of spare portion of the battery, and that battery at that point, I can't guarantee that you're going to have you're going to have that 24 hours at minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit. So it is a system that's available. I don't know how useful it is because I've had self-test messages that didn't go through. But again, I think you have to really dig into the literature because they do try to make you believe that it's using all of the satellites. No, it's only using 2 of them. And they're in a geometry that's not really, potentially not the best for your application. Okay, so on to Iridium satellite-based systems. Iridium is a commercial satellite system. It is 66 satellites in low Earth orbit. It's been used for a number of years to provide data and voice. Some of its biggest user is actually U.S. military. It requires a subscription to use the service. The 4 most common products that you see right now on the current time are the Garmin InReach. I've got one of those here, I'll pass around. The Acer Bivystick, the Somewear global hotspot, looks like a little teardrop, and the Zoleo. There's kind of pluses and minuses to these. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Iridium. So Iridium is a constellation of 66 satellites that fly at about 485 miles above the Earth, but they fly in polar orbits, meaning they fly roughly over the poles. So that gives them worldwide coverage. So if you're at the North Pole, the South Pole, and you're using this system, you're probably going to be just fine. One of the advantages Iridium has is it has Crosslinks. So if you look at the right-hand graphic, if your Iridium device sends up a signal to a satellite, and if, for example, that gateway to its right was down for some reason, that satellite would be able to cross-link it to its neighbor. And if that satellite couldn't get that signal down to the ground, it would cross-link itself to another neighbor and so forth until that signal gets down. So that provides a lot of robustness to those systems. So that Crosslink makes Iridium a kind of a, definitely have some nice capabilities to it. So with that polar orbit, you get worldwide coverage. It's kind of really helped out by those cross-link signals between the satellites. It does offer two-way communication via text or email. It's commercial service, so again, you've got to pay to use it. There is a rescue element of it. It's provided by Geos Response LLC. It's a commercial center in Montgomery, Texas. So it's not U.S. Air Force, it's not anything else. It's a commercial service in Texas, United States, that would kind of serve as the RCC for all of the, or take the place of all of the RCCs, all of the 35 rescue coordination centers that are around the planet. So they've got a pretty important job because they need to be up on all of the local search and rescue forces that might be available pretty much anywhere on the planet. So they have an important job. And it's kind of interesting because pretty much every other commercial service uses this one, the GOES Response LLC. As we talk about them, I'll describe them as well. So the signals going up to and from the satellites are in the L-band frequency. And you might ask, well, why the hell are you going into such detail? So L-band, S-band, UHF, VHF are all lower frequency signals, and they tend to do better when you're in an environment where there's rain, snow, some level of terrain or foliage. So, a few leaves above you, if you're in the middle of, the Sequoia National Forest and there's several hundred feet of tree above you, the chances are that none of these signals are going to get out. So, but the L-band, S-band, UHF, VHF are all relatively good. They're attenuated at least by things that you're going to encounter in nature, rain, snow, and some element of foliage. So that's kind of why I'm trying to go to that length to kind of show you that, these are good frequencies for this kind of application. So what are the pros and cons? For Iridium-based system, you definitely get the two-way messaging capability. You can kind of have a conversation with someone. A few months ago, I was having a conversation with Brett Book, who I think is on here, from middle of Utah, BFE Utah, with absolutely zero cell coverage, and being able to communicate. One nice feature is you can, again, it costs you a little bit extra money, you can get weather forecasts. So you can imagine, like, we were out there doing slot canyons, and if you've ever done slots, you're probably very concerned about weather. Kind of, are there storms in the area, something that's going to potentially cause flash flooding. So that this system allows you, again, for a little extra money, for each one to get a detailed forecast for your specific location. It does provide that rescue capability. All of the devices that I'm going to talk about here do have a kind of a button on the unit itself. So even if you didn't have, or your phone was broken, you could kind of lift a little flap on the device and press that to initiate a rescue. The problem is you may not get kind of two-way communication with the rescuers like you could get if your system was fully functional. Again, it's got crosslink satellites and polar orbits, worldwide coverage. Okay, so the cons. So subscription fees, pretty much monthly fees, and then depending upon what plan you get, you could have overages. You're going to pay for every weather report you typically get. They are lower transmission power. So with the COSPAS SARSAT, it was 5 watts. For Iridium, these units are all about 1.5 watts, so much lower power. Many of them require use of a cell phone or a tablet for messaging. So for example, on the Bivystick, which is shown here, there is no screen at all on it. So if you want to use any of the features for messaging, you've got to have another device. So in this case, typically a phone or a tablet So that's something else to carry, something else to drop, something else to freeze. So kind of be thinking about that for your utilization of these systems. Again, you've got multiple pieces to your system that could break or fail because of, it could fail because of battery. You failed to charge the thing before you left the house. Or you've been doing the Colorado Trail for several days or weeks, and you've been sending out a lot of messages tracking, and that's something I failed to mention, but these devices do offer real-time tracking capability that you can provide a set of interval of, I think as low as 10 minutes or even a minute, I think, and basically send out a digital breadcrumb of where you are, so that if you've got friends or family that are kind of monitoring your progress, they can kind of keep track of you. And again, the user, you're responsible for charging all of these elements. The phone, the device itself. So they typically don't have like a AA lithium battery port. There are these proprietary batteries. You've got to plug it into some kind of power brick or something else to recharge it. Okay, so Globalstar, satellite-based system. Globalstar is another commercial satellite system. It consists of 48 satellites that are in low Earth orbit. Globalstar also offers data and voice services for many users. Again, it's a subscription-based service. There's really two different devices that make up Globalstar. There's the Spot on the right here, which is basically a one-way messenger. Messages go out, you can have it'll broadcast your position, or it can broadcast preset messages. And then there's a Spot X, which offers that same tracking capability, but it also offers back and forth messaging capability via text or email. Okay, so the difference between Globalstar and Iridium is that Globalstar satellites are like what I call bent pipes, meaning that if you send a signal to the satellite will attempt to find a ground site, one of its own ground sites below it that it can see. And if you send a signal to that satellite and there is no ground site within view, that message fails. So it's a real concern, especially as you get into kind of, say, more remote areas, and I'll show you kind of coverage maps, but that lack of crosslink, like the Iridium or CoastPass SARSAT, definitely is a weakness to this system. So again, if the satellite can't see a ground site, your message doesn't go through. But those satellites for the Globalstar system, again, there are 48 of them. They're at 879 miles up, and they're inclined at 52 degrees. So that's kind of the tilt of the orbit relative to the equator. And what that means that they're only 52 is that you don't end up getting really good polar coverage. So I would suggest if you're going to Antarctica, that this might not be a really good system for you, because you're not going to get good coverage to begin with. Okay, so here are their maps of service. So on the left is the spot coverage, so kind of that one way from receipt or unit to satellite, and then the Spot X service, which is the two-way communication. You can kind of see some gaps there that exist, and that's my estimation is due to probably maybe older equipment in some of those areas that don't allow that two-way communication up to the satellite. There's only a receive antenna there. But again, you can kind of see that if you're in sub-Saharan Africa, you're in Greenland, you're in Hawaii, these systems might not be really good for you. So there definitely have some weaknesses to this system. And again, you don't have worldwide coverage. This is definitely not the one you want to take for your round the world sailing voyage. Okay, so they also offer this distress signal monitoring via the same company all the commercial units use, which is the Geos Response LLC. And again, they're using L-band and S-band, which are still relatively good frequencies for this kind of use. So pros, two-way messaging for the Spot X, real-time tracking you have for the Spot and the Spot X, and you have the call for rescue capability. Cons, you don't have worldwide coverage, and due to the lower inclination and the lack of crosslinks, there's a higher chance that your call for help might not go through in certain parts of the world. It has a subscription fee, and it's got a really low transmission power, about 0.2 watts compared to 5 watts for the COSPAS SARSAT. So again, relatively low power. So this is definitely an older system, but I want to let you know what's available. Okay, the last one I'll talk to you about is called it's an Intelsat based system. So SatPack, that kind of funky looking thing that sits on the back of your phone there, utilizes only 2 geostationary Intelsat Galaxy satellites that fly at geostationary orbit, so about 22,000 miles. They require the use of your cell phone or tablet. They also offer distress signal monitoring via commercial GOES Response LLC. They use C-band communication. And C-band is definitely, it's a different animal. It has higher losses due to foliage and rain and snow. It's higher bandwidth, but also narrower beam. And that'll be important here, kind of, because if you intend to use this system, you've got to go out, and the unit has got a little application on it, and it'll use your GPS location to determine, and your compass that's in your phone, to be able to figure out how to point this device so that you can get a hold of the satellite. So again, you can see the location, the center graphic. You can see the location of those 2 satellites, the 2 GOES satellites that are there, and kind of 3-dimensionally, you can see there's just 2 of them out there. It's definitely, you got to basically maintain the orientation while you're attempting to do communication using this system. So you can imagine that might be kind of a pain in the ass if you're trying to use it for tracking. You're going to have to stop, point the satellite, or point the phone and this antenna device thing at the satellite to be able to get signal to go through. They say the coverage is limited to basically United States. Based on where the satellites are located, I kind of think you'd probably have coverage in most of the Americas, but their literature all describes that it's only United States that the coverage is there. But kind of based on geometry, I would think you'd have at least through Central America decent coverage. But again, they say only US. So SatPack pros, it's got 2-way messaging capability. It's got real-time tracking capability if you're willing to stop and point the antenna towards the satellite. You can get weather forecast. You can call for rescue. I don't know that it's almost a bit of a gimmick, but they have something that they call Ask Dr. Dex, which is artificial intelligent first aid. So I guess you could kind of submit questions about health-related items and get some answers. One thing that's different about this is that it's not a subscription base. It's a kind of pay-as-you-go. So if you were going to use this unit, you go buy the unit. If my recollection was right, it's about $430 or $450 to buy the unit. And then you would buy like so many messages that you get kind of in your queue. Then you kind of keep burning those down. And once you're done, then you have to kind of recharge your number of messages you have going out. They have higher transmission power, 8 watts. So it's even more power than the COSPAS SARSAT. But again, I think there's some limitations that you have to take into account. Part of it is that the ability to turn that receiver and point it towards a satellite. Now, some of the cons as I see for this system, there's limited coverage. Again, I think primarily the Americas. And because the device communicates with geostationary satellites above the equator, you require a clear view to the south if you're in the northern hemisphere. And that's kind of what I'm trying to display in the graphic on the upper right-hand corner, that if you're on the north side of a mountain and you have your receiver or your unit and you're trying to transmit, but there's a big mountain and the satellite's to the south, that signal is never going to go through. And that'll kind of be apparent in the example that I'll try to use. But because you need to be able to see the geostationary belt, I consider this a poor choice for emergency use. Okay, so you might ask, well, what the hell does all this mean? I've tried to put together a use case. In this case, Mount St. Helens. I know John and I and Tommy have been up there, and thankfully we went to the summit. We didn't go to the crater, but if you were in the crater, you'd be several hundred meters below the surface of the elevation of the summit. But you can kind of see in the lower graphic that the way that mountain is situated, the crater kind of faces to the south. So the crater opens up to the north, meaning you have if you're in the middle of the crater, you have a hard time kind of seeing to the south. And that's going to be a big deal here. Just a minute. Okay. All right, so for those that are familiar with SDK, commercially available satellite toolkit, it's made by ANSYS. I was able to use our terrain mapping feature and kind of plug in for an Iridium based system if you had someone that was on the summit of Mount St. Helens and then what I call lost hiker, which is in the crater. And the green lines, as I play this video, will kind of show you over the span of a given hour. I basically chose today's date between 1700 and 1800 Zulu time. So it's already passed, but basically the satellites that you would see over an hour. So let's kind of just play this and hopefully it will make sense. But so as the satellites are flying over, so in 24 seconds, an hour will have passed. But you can see that the climber that's on the summit is able to see a lot more satellites because he or she's view includes a lot more sky. Whereas the climber or the hiker that's lost or fallen into the crater is masked. He or she can't see a lot of satellites because pretty much everything to the south of them is blocked. Okay, all right, now for comparison, I'm gonna show you what the same scenario looks like if you're using the COSPAS SARSAT based system. You can kind of begin to see the spider web here of all the satellites that these can see. And what I want you to kind of notice is that as I play the video, the hiker on the summit can see a butt ton of satellites because of their great geometry. But because there are so many satellites that are part of this COSPAS SARSAT system, and they're in so many different geometries, even the hiker that's in the crater still can see a large number of satellites. So again, this is in hours of time kind of condensed into 24 seconds. But you can see that there's you're able to see a lot of satellites, and there's pretty much never a moment that goes past that you can't see multiple satellites. And those multiple satellites mean not only is the chance of your signal going through much higher, those satellites are also triangulating your position. So even if there was a problem with, say, the GPS receiver in your unit, the satellites are triangulating you and can help locate you, help to locate your position, which is huge. Okay, so I know a lot of us engineers like graphs, so I tried to show up over that same hour from 1700 to 1800, so 5 p.m. to 6 p.m., how many satellites you can see for the various systems. When you're on the summit, you're able to see the 2 Intelsat Galaxy satellites that are part of this system. When you're in the crater, you can't see any of them. Okay, so Globalstar, if you're on the summit, that's basically, those are the satellites kind of as they fly overhead, the satellites and how they're available. Now, if you jump down into the crater, you can see that that terrain masking significantly reduces the number of, or the duration that you can see those satellites. And you can see that there's gaps roughly between 1735 and 1740 where you can't see any. So you push the button and nothing happens. Eventually that signal will go out, but it can take a while because you're in this terrain masked environment. Okay, Iridium, a little bit better, but there's still gaps when you're in the crater. Here, I think it's about 3 minutes. Again, this is just a sample to show you kind of the density of the satellites you can see. And this is Coast Pass SARSAT. So you're never able to not see a satellite. And in most cases, you can probably see about 10, even when you're in the crater. So again, it's a really, really robust system. Okay, so in summary, what are the things that I suggest you consider? And first question, if you ask me, what should I get? I'd ask you, what do you want the device for? If safety of life is your primary concern, I tell you that the device must work under all conditions that you're going to be in to get that call for help. That are you just mainly interested in sending and receiving messages? Hey, I covered 20 miles on the CT today. What are you guys having for dinner? If you want to get forecast, these are all kind of questions that might steer you towards a different device. The one thing I really, really want you to think about, though, is what's the terrain that you're going to explore, and what that really equates to is how much of the sky are you going to be able to see? Are you backpacking through middle of the desert where you've got really nothing to block your view of the satellites? That might be a different equation than, say, if you're mountaineering and you might be on the north face of a mountain and not be able to see to the south, or conversely, if in the southern hemisphere, if you're on the south side and you can't see to the north. Then you get into some kind of really unique situations, which I definitely kind of steer me, and that's like for slot canyons. I do slots with Paula and Robin and Bill, and there's very often times where you can't see much of the sky, and sometimes you have to be thinking about, if at the worst time something happened and you really need help, what's the device for you? The next question I'll be talking about or asking you about is, what's the activity risk and the consequences? If you're going and you're hiking Bar Trail to the top of Tava, I'm going to suggest that's not especially a risky situation. It might be conditions if you're going in the middle of January at night, whatever. But the chances are you're going to be able to potentially have cell phone coverage. You're not going to be terrain masked very much, but ultimately it's consequences. So the answers might be a lot different if you're doing a really remote slot canyon. It's very remote. The risk, the consequences of someone being injured can be much more severe. So I'm going to kind of ask you to think about what are the risks, your risk tolerance, and what are the consequences if someone is injured. Or ask, what are the consequences if your message doesn't go through? Next is cost. So there's the purchase price you have to consider, and then there's recurring cost for subscription-based or use fees that you've got to consider. Next, I'll ask you, where do you intend to go? If you're going to go far north, you're going to go to areas, sub-Saharan Africa, then that probably, rules out at least one of these systems. The next question I'll ask is about temperature. And what kind of environment are you going to be in? So if you're not familiar with it, batteries don't like cold. If you're ever used a digital camera on really, really cold days, I know Bill and I and Sam and Daniel, one time on top of Rainier, I got 4 pictures out of a quote unquote freeze-proof camera. So you have to be thinking about the temperature effects on batteries. What's the ruggedness of the device or the collection of devices? So if you have a PLB, it's a single device. If you've got a SAT pack, then it's at least 2 devices. It's the transmitter and your phone. And how will all these devices work if you drop them? What if they get wet? What if they're frozen? These are all kind of things that I think you should look at and be considering. The last is human factors. If you're using a commercial system, you're going to have to be responsible for charging all the devices. Your phone, the InReach device. You're responsible for charging all these devices. You're responsible for paying the recurring cost. And I don't know how these systems would respond in an emergency if you hadn't paid your subscription. I'm not sure how it would work. You're also, if you have a CoastPass SARSAT system, a PLB, you're responsible for sending that in for a battery replacement every 5 to 7 years. And it's pretty, they have a system, and mine is set to have its next battery put in March 16th, 2022. So you're responsible for doing that, making sure you're sending it off. They'll do a full check of them, but that's something that's on me to do. It's not like I can just pull this thing out of the closet, 5 years from now and expect it to work. So ultimately, here's my recommendations. If safety of life is your concern, a PLB is the way to go. I was able to interview the NASA search and rescue manager, and Lisa told me basically that PLBs are 99.9% reliable. They are purpose-built. Iridium is the next I'd list it as a system with the polar orbits and crosslinks. It might take a little bit longer for that emergency message to go out under normal terrain conditions, but that's going to be the next best. Globalstar's third, the Intelsat-based SAT pack, I don't recommend for safety of life. I think there's too many things that to make it something that I would not recommend you bet your life on. If you're looking primarily for two-way messaging and tracking, the Iridium-based systems, InReach, Bivystick, Somewear, Zoleo are all, I think, somewhat equivalent. I'm a little, I like the InReach Mini in that it's small, it's light. I do have to carry a separate GPS receiver. I know that there are some InReach devices that have a, basically it's an addition onto the GPS receiver. I think they're all pretty good. I personally don't have any experience with Bivystick, Somewear, or Zoleo, but I can tell you that the systems that they're using are all going to be about the same as the InReach. So technically, I would say they're all roughly on par. Globalstar's is SpotX and Spot. They're coming in second, and then the Intelsat base SAT pack comes in third. So that kind of finishes my presentation. I'll open it up to questions. People, I'll try to answer them again. I think in my description of my presentation, I said that I would talk about costs, and I will give you that portion of your admittance fee back, because there's just too many things to consider here. There's just there literally even within the InReach system, there's like 4 different subscription levels. They all have their pros and cons based on your usage. It just really becomes too much to provide you the technical merits of each of the systems and the cost. I'll let you research that on your own. But I wanted to be able to describe and explain how these systems work, because the literature that's there is sometimes misleading and sometimes doesn't tell the whole picture. So hopefully the kind of homework I've done for you here will let you make a better or informed decision as you go forward. So Joe, I'll pass it over to you to, if there's any questions.
Thank you. You might have questions in the chat.
Okay.
All right. Well, Joe, thank you so much. This is other Joe. I really appreciated the insights. And I have to say, though, all the acronyms remind me of growing up with my military contractor dad. He'd come home and seems like speaking a different language, but everything made sense here. So thanks so much for being willing to do that and being flexible to do it through Zoom. We did have a couple of comments that came through, as well as a question. Alan Bridges made a remark that the Garmin InReach will turn on and transmit if someone opens the SOS button and pushes it. Doesn't look like there's a need to turn it on first. One question we did have from Warren Paul, he's curious to know which of the CoastPass SARSAT units have RLS.
There's basically the only units that are sold in the European Union. It's not Acer, it's whatever I had in that graphic. I can kind of look through there and try to find it for you, but it's, let's see if I can find it real quick for you.
Okay, and then while you're pulling that up, another question that just came in that might dovetail with that. Arlene Richter is asking if you can show the screen again with the CoastPass just to get the names of the devices that utilize that particular technology.
So I think it's Mercmurdo, Fast Find is the only device that I've been able to find that has the return link service feature. And I'll try to display the
All right. And
okay, was that what was asked regarding the units, or was it the? I'm sorry, was it the units that use CoastPass SARSAT? Again, that was just a sample of them, if that was the question. Fast Find, Mercmurdo, the Ocean Signal, and Acer are just examples. They're probably, I bet you could probably find 30 different commercially available units that use the CoastPass SARSAT. But if you're looking for them, what you want to look for is a PLB, Personal Locator Beacon.
all right, we do have another question asking if we know if subscription services will cover the cost of rescue, but I imagine that would depend on the level of subscription service, if that's even possible.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. In the research that I did, I didn't come across any that indicated that they had that. There are some, I think it's Global Rescue and a couple of other services that you can purchase. And I would recommend, I know that I've going to South America, I've purchased some of those. Basically it's insurance that would provide air flight. Would provide get you to a U.S. medical quality facility and get you airlifted back to the United States. But there are services, but I don't know of any that are linked to a commercially available system.
Yep. All right. David is asking if there's any major differences in which SAR resources would be dispatched, and then does that differ based upon the unit used?
No, it makes no difference. The signal gets routed through a mission control, and then that kind of, for example, John and I and Scott were on the Matterhorn again. We get pushed. That would get sent to the appropriate unit in Switzerland as far as a rescue center. For the PLBs, basically, it's all uniform. The unit that you have, the PLB unit you have, doesn't change the rescue or the quality of the rescue. It's all basically what is the best resource to help you out.
All right, that makes sense. Looks like one final question we'll take from Trevor. I'm gonna just take a guess that he's got a military background because he said great briefing. But his question is, any info on future constellations that might offer additional services? And then also any talk of receivers on the mega constellations like Starlink?
So Trevor, I hope I did you justice with some of the STK stuff there, but the only growth that I've seen potentially is the inclusion of BeiDou, so the Chinese equivalent of GPS. It's kind of funny though, because when I was getting ready to do this presentation a year ago, there was a lot more talk in NASA and NOA documents about BeiDou. There isn't anymore. The only place you find reference to BeiDou being included potentially in the future for COSPAS SARSAT is in Chinese documents. So I don't know if that'll be something that would be included. Obviously, the more receivers you have, the better the geometry, the faster you're found. So there's, probably it'd be a good thing if they were there. The mega constellations, Trevor, I have no idea. I've really heard nothing about it. And my guess is that it's probably not something that's going to be sought really quickly because of the fact that these are government systems. This tremendous amount of money has been spent getting them to this point. But I could imagine that if you could have, add a couple hundred more, maybe the system will sense that you're about to be in danger and trigger it itself. But no, I'm joking. I have heard nothing about additional receivers. Again, one of the monumental things that's happened is the inclusion on GPS satellites, Galileo and GLONASS, because those satellites were kind of a game changer to the geometry of the receivers in space. So they've definitely made the system much more robust and allowed just your signal to be caught that much quicker and that much more reliably.
Great. Well, Joe, thanks again for your time.
Hang on. We've got one question from the room here.
One more question. All right.
Yeah, Tom Mulcahy has got a question.
Can you see a difference between, say, a PLB that doesn't have any communication, text communication, with something like an InReach where you could communicate with the rescuer as to injury conditions, your personal situation, or is that kind of communication available?
It absolutely is, and it's something I probably was remiss in discussing, but that GEOS system would provide communication to you and basically try to assess the level of the injuries. So they would be able to understand how many people are injured. So that could potentially change the search and rescue effort. You know, if there's multiple people that are injured, that could kind of change the way that the response is provided. They also might be able to direct you and say, well, wait a minute, according to the topo map that I'm looking at, can you get about a quarter mile north of where you're at? Because there's a big clearing that if you can move your victim there, we'll have the helicopter will be there in X hours. So there's definitely that piece of it, that that communication element of being able to, certainly I'm sure that it drives down the stress level significantly to know that you're in communication with someone who is now, they're in communication with the resources that are being called to bring in the search and rescue. But definitely that could, I could imagine that if you're not really well versed, excuse me, in first aid, that they might be able to walk you through something that is really something that is maybe out of your wheelhouse as far as the injury that's you're trying to tend to. So that's certainly something that could be an advantage to a system like that. So I think that's it, Joe.
All right, well, very good. Thanks for catching that last question there. Didn't mean to cut you off, Tom. But Joe, thanks again for your expertise and time tonight putting the talk together. Again, I personally appreciate your flexibility, being willing to do it kind of a hybrid Zoom and then having folks over to your house. So hopefully in the future, like I said, near-term future, we'll get back to more of the in-person events. But thanks again to everybody who made it this evening. The presentation tonight was recorded, so I'll get a link to that recording out to those who had registered here within the next couple of days. But with that, we'll sign off for tonight. Everybody stay safe and enjoy the mountains.
Take care.
Thanks, Joe.